Houston, a city notorious for its reliance on the private automobile, was once so dependent upon public transportation that streetcars dictated where new suburbs rose. The first attempt was a mule-drawn streetcar down McKinney Street in 1868, but the venture soon failed due to the high fare of 10 cents. A different company revived the mule cars in the mid-1870s. Charging only a nickel, the operation thrived. The first electric streetcars came to the Bayou City in 1891. They were open-sided and had their own central power station. And yes, there were occasional collisions with animal-drawn wagons. About the same time, one of the enterprising owners of the company that held the streetcar franchise led a team of investors to develop a planned community at the end of a new line that ran northwest of town. That development was called Houston Heights. A for-profit business running a public service can be difficult, and the Houston Electric Street Railway Company began defaulting on bonds around the turn of the century. Soon, a Boston firm owned and operated Houston streetcars. Among their first improvements was the opening of Highland Park, an amusement park at the north end of the Houston Avenue line that encouraged more ridership. The streetcars were also the city's first Jim Crow battleground. In 1903, Council passed an ordinance requiring cars to be segregated by race. It became law in spite of Houston Electric's vigorous protests, and it prompted a boycott by African American riders. Before that protest ended, a streetcar workers' strike turned violent, adding to the troubles. Still, Houstonians were so reliant on public transportation that the site of a new baseball park was selected in 1905 largely by being adjacent to the streetcar line. Growth in the system continued, and during the Notso Carnival in November 1914, the system topped 900,000 passenger trips in a week in a city with a total population around 100,000. Just 3 years prior, an interurban train began running between the downtowns of Houston and Galveston, eventually making the trip in as little as 75 minutes for the cost of $1.25. Mass transit across America started to decline with the rise in automobile ownership in the 1920s. A decade later, in most cities, buses began to replace streetcars, which eventually lingered only as oddities in places like San Francisco and New Orleans. Houston was no exception. The last streetcar squealed to a halt in 1940, and soon the steel tracks were pulled up and recycled for the war effort. The interurban route was purchased by the state of Texas and became the state's first freeway, still linking Houston and Galveston. It was christened the Gulf Freeway at its grand opening in 1948, even while construction on it continued. Many commuters would say that construction has never stopped. While buses ruled local transit in the post-war years, mention of futuristic options like monorail occasionally popped up as well. In 1979, Greater Houston got Metro. Funded by a 1-cent sales tax, it replaced the city-run HuTran. By the late 1980s, when other cities across the country were building new light rail transit systems, political posturing by a handful of elected officials often usurped the will of local voters. While mass transit in Dallas soared, it was delayed in Houston by 2 decades. Today, Houston has a scaled-back inner-loop light rail system, and there is talk of commuter rail to certain suburbs. There is even a planned interurban in the form of a high-speed bullet train to Dallas.